In a quiet, close-knit neighborhood, Jared Williams, a dedicated firefighter and new homeowner, arrives on Oakfield Court, hoping to settle into his dream home. But what begins as a fresh start soon turns into a test of resilience. His arrival stirs up unspoken tensions, and some neighbors, set in their ways, see him as an outsider. When a crisis hits close to home, Jared's response challenges their assumptions, turning Oakfield Court upside down. Will this neighborhood find a way to move beyond suspicion and fear? Can Jared bridge the divide, building trust and unity in a place that once saw him as a stranger? Join us as we explore Jared's journey, a story of empathy, courage, and the power of one person to spark real change. If stories like these inspire you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join our community of positive storytelling. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what's the last story that gave you hope? Now let's dive in. The warm autumn light bathed Oakfield Court in a golden glow as Jared Williams pulled his SUV up the winding driveway. He stepped out, breathing in the crisp air tinged with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Before him stood his new home, a modest two-story with freshly painted shutters and a wide front porch, a place he'd dreamed of for years, a place he'd earned. Jared's muscles ached from packing, but the ache was a good one, a reminder of the hard work he'd put into making this day possible. Oakfield Court was a place that held promise, an inviting neighborhood where the lawns were manicured and the homes well-kept. For once, he felt he could leave behind the apartment blocks and crowded streets of his former neighborhood. Here there was space, peace. But as he unloaded his first box, he noticed eyes on him. He looked up to see a face peeking from behind a lace curtain in the window of the house across the street. The curtain dropped quickly, and Jared gave a small chuckle. He couldn't blame them. He'd probably be curious too if a new face showed up on this quiet street. Still, that one look so swift and almost suspicious lingered in his mind. But he shook it off and returned to unloading his boxes. His focus was on this new beginning. He'd spent years moving up the ranks in the city's fire department, now standing proudly as one of the few black captains in the region. Oakfield Court was his reward, a place to plant roots. As Jared carried a box labeled kitchen up the porch steps, a soft voice called out from behind him. He turned to see an elderly woman with a gentle face and neatly pinned silver hair. She was standing at the edge of his lawn, a hesitant smile on her face. "Hello there," she called, waving slightly. Jared set the box down and walked over, extending his hand. "Hi there. I'm Jared Williams, just moved in." She reached out to shake his hand. "Linda Walsh. I live right next door." Her gaze held a mix of warmth and curiosity. "You picked a lovely house, you know. The Taylors used to live here. They were very quiet, kept to themselves, but always friendly." Jared smiled, grateful for the kindness in her eyes. "Thank you, Linda. I'm hoping to keep things peaceful here, too. I like the neighborhood. It seems nice." Linda nodded, her gaze shifting briefly toward the house across the street before returning to him. Yes, people here like things calm. You're from the city, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am. I work my way up in the city's fire department. Been a firefighter for 15 years now," Jared replied with a touch of pride. Her eyes lit up. "A firefighter? That's wonderful. Hard work, I'm sure." But her gaze darted back across the street, lingering just a second too long. Jared glanced over his shoulder. "Everyone around here okay, with new folks moving in?" "Oh, most certainly," she replied a bit too quickly. "It's just, well, this street doesn't get many new residents. People get comfortable." The word lingered between them, heavier than she intended. Jared's smile remained, but he could sense an unspoken tension. "Well, Linda, I hope to meet everyone soon," he said, aiming to end the conversation on a positive note. She nodded. "I'll be around if you need anything," she added before walking back to her house, casting one last look over her shoulder. The sun dipped below the horizon as Jared continued to unpack. Each box he unloaded felt like a small victory, a piece of his life settling into this new chapter. But as the evening grew darker, he felt a strange prickling sensation, a sense that he was still being watched. He glanced around. Across the street, behind a row of bushes, he caught a glimpse of movement. It was a man, perhaps in his 50s, with graying hair and a rigid posture, watching him from his porch. Their eyes met, and the man quickly turned away, retreating into the shadows of his house. Jared felt a slight tension in his shoulders. It wasn't uncommon for people to be cautious of newcomers, but the intensity of that look had unsettled him. He continued his work, pushing the unease aside, telling himself it was just his nerves. After all, this was his neighborhood now, too. The next morning, Jared woke early, his body still sore from moving, but his spirit undeterred. He was determined to start his day on a good note. He brewed a pot of coffee, took a steaming cup out onto his porch, and gazed down the street. The quiet here was calming, but it had an edge, a silence layered with something he couldn't quite name. Across the street, the man from last night was outside, watering his lawn with the precision of someone who took pride in routine. Jared gave a friendly wave, but the man simply stared, his face unreadable, before turning back to his task. Jared felt a pang of frustration. It wasn't like he hadn't expected a little awkwardness. He knew he was one of the few black residents on this street. He prepared himself for the possibility of discomfort, but the cold reception stung more than he'd anticipated. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. Later, he took his coffee inside and focused on unpacking, determined not to let one person sour his experience. As the week passed, Jared settled into his routines. He introduced himself to a few more neighbors, each interaction tinged with varying levels of politeness, hesitation, or curiosity. Linda continued to greet him warmly whenever they crossed paths, but he noticed that other neighbors, like the man across the street, whose name he'd learned was Sam Peterson, kept a wary distance. One evening, as Jared was carrying a few more boxes from his SUV, he overheard faint voices from Linda's yard. She was speaking with another neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Connie. Their words drifted over in soft fragments. "He seems nice, but from the city, you know. I just hope things don't change too much." Jared felt a tightening in his chest. It was subtle, but the words carried weight. He didn't know exactly what they were worried about, him or the idea of something unfamiliar. But it was clear they were discussing him. He adjusted the box in his arms and continued into the house, trying to ignore the knot forming in his stomach. A few days later, Jared was finally relaxing with a book when he heard a sharp knock at the door. He opened it to find Sam Peterson standing there, arms folded tightly across his chest. Jared felt a jolt of surprise. He hadn't expected Sam to approach him. "Mr. Williams," Sam began, his tone formal. "I just wanted to ask about the cars parked on the street. They're making it look a bit crowded." Jared blinked, taken aback. "Those are my friends helping me move in," he replied calmly. "They won't be here long." Sam gave a tight nod. "I just thought you should know that this is a quiet neighborhood. We don't usually have so many visitors." The implication hung heavy in the air. Jared felt his hands tense, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm just settling in, Mr. Peterson. I'll make sure things are as quiet as you're used to." Sam's eyes lingered on him for a moment before he nodded again, curtly, and turned to leave without another word. Later that evening, as Jared was winding down, he heard sirens in the distance. He glanced out his window, puzzled, as the flashing lights of a police cruiser reflected off his living room walls. His stomach sank as the car stopped in front of his house. He opened the door just as two officers stepped out. "Good evening, sir," one of them said, his tone professional but wary. "We received a call about suspicious activity in the neighborhood. Are you the homeowner?" Jared swallowed his irritation, forcing himself to remain calm. "Yes, officers. I just moved in last week." The officers exchanged a look. "We've had reports of a suspicious presence," the officer said, the words careful, but the implication clear. Jared felt the weight of the moment settle on him, a familiar frustration he'd hoped he wouldn't encounter here, of all places. "I'm here legally, officers. This is my home." Linda stepped outside, her face a mask of confusion and concern as she saw the police at Jared's door. She offered a tentative smile and walked over. "Officers, this is Mr. Williams," she said softly. "I can vouch for him. He's my neighbor." After a few tense moments, the officers nodded, apologized, and left. Jared felt a flood of relief mixed with frustration as Linda looked at him, her expression one of reluctant sympathy. "I'm sorry, Jared," she said quietly. "People here they're not used to change." Jared nodded, swallowing the bitter response that rose in his throat. He knew this was more than a misunderstanding, but he didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable. "Thanks, Linda," he managed. "I appreciate it." As Linda walked back to her house, Jared stood on his porch, feeling the weight of isolation settle over him once more. This place, so full of potential, now felt like a maze of wary eyes and whispered judgments. But he knew he couldn't let one night or a handful of stares define his experience. He'd faced tougher situations. He was here to stay. Days passed, and Jared's presence remained a quiet, yet charged subject of discussion among the residents of Oakfield Court. Each time he stepped outside, it felt as though the very air was charged with whispers. The friendly waves he gave were often returned hesitantly, or not at all. One evening, Jared overheard a conversation between Sam Peterson and another neighbor, a tall man named Carl. They stood near Sam's car, voices low, but the words carrying easily across the driveway. "Just don't know about this guy," Sam was saying. "Oakfield Court's always been a certain way, you know? And now we've got someone who doesn't fit that." Carl nodded, a sympathetic grimace on his face. "I hear you, Sam. Things do seem different." Jared felt a tightness in his chest, but forced himself to ignore the comment. He couldn't afford to let small-mindedness define his experience here. His whole life, he'd encountered and overcome these kinds of subtle, and sometimes not-so-subtle barriers. And yet, hearing it here, in what was supposed to be his sanctuary, left a bruise he hadn't expected. The next day, Linda approached Jared as he was raking leaves along the edge of his lawn. Her face was troubled, her eyes downcast as if debating something difficult. Finally, she spoke. "Jared, I wanted to ask," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I know you've probably sensed that not everyone here has been as welcoming as they should be." Jared gave a small, weary smile. "I noticed, yes." Linda looked around, as if checking that they were alone, then stepped closer. "I want you to know I've spoken with some of the neighbors, told them they need to judge a person by their actions, not by—" Her voice trailed off, but Jared knew what she meant. "Thank you, Linda," he replied gently. "That means a lot." She gave a small nod, visibly relieved. "It's just you deserve a fair chance, Jared. We all do. I don't want to see good people driven away, just because things look a little different." Her words stayed with him, a small ray of hope in the otherwise tense atmosphere. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. A few days later, Oakfield Court's residents gathered for a neighborhood association meeting in the community center. Jared, hoping for a chance to connect with more neighbors, decided to attend. When he entered, a hush fell over the room, eyes shifting toward him, some curious, others guarded. The meeting began with the usual updates, maintenance schedules, community events, and a few complaints about late-night noise from some teenagers down the road. Then Sam Peterson stood, clearing his throat. "I'd like to address something that's been on my mind," he began, eyes narrowing in Jared's direction. "Lately, there's been a shift in the atmosphere here, and I think we need to be mindful of how we're letting our neighborhood change." A murmur ran through the crowd. Jared felt a pulse of frustration, but held his expression neutral, waiting to see where Sam's words would lead. "Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't welcome new folks," Sam continued, his tone carefully measured. "But maybe we should be cautious about keeping Oakfield Court the place it's always been, a safe, family-friendly environment." Jared knew that safe was a code word, a quiet insinuation that somehow his presence might be a threat. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. But before he could speak, Linda stood up. "I think what's safe and friendly is when we welcome our neighbors without suspicion," she said, her voice calm but firm. "And I don't think we're doing ourselves any favors by treating someone as a stranger just because he's new. Jared has done nothing but bring kindness and respect to this neighborhood." A ripple of agreement moved through a few members of the group, though others exchanged uncertain glances. Sam looked momentarily taken aback, but quickly recovered, crossing his arms tightly. The meeting wrapped up soon after, but Jared could sense that the neighborhood was now divided. Some were silently supportive, like Linda, but others, like Sam, remained firmly in opposition. Yet for the first time, Jared felt a glimmer of change. He had allies here. The following Saturday, Jared volunteered at a local school fair, representing the fire department. His booth, set up with fire safety pamphlets and a hands-on demonstration for kids, drew a steady stream of curious families. Children gathered around him as he demonstrated the equipment, their eyes wide with excitement as he explained how firefighters worked to keep communities safe. To Jared's surprise, he saw a few of his Oakfield Court neighbors among the parents watching him. Even Sam Peterson's wife, Lydia, seemed impressed, nodding approvingly as Jared helped her young son try on a firefighter's hat. Afterward, Lydia approached Jared, her expression hesitant. "Thank you for doing this," she said, glancing at her son, who was still beaming from his time at the booth. He's been talking about becoming a firefighter for months. This meant a lot to him. Jared smiled, his voice warm. "It's my pleasure, really. If he wants to visit the station, let me know. We'd love to have him." Lydia nodded, a faint smile softening her guarded expression. "I'll mention it to him. Thank you again, Jared." As she walked away, Jared felt a flicker of hope. Maybe change was possible, even here, one person at a time. Late one evening, as Jared was winding down for the night, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find Linda, her face drawn and serious. "Jared, I thought you should know. Sam's been talking to some of the other neighbors. He's trying to convince them to file a complaint with the neighborhood association, something about disturbances and out-of-character behavior." Jared's heart sank. He had been careful to respect the neighborhood's unspoken rules, avoiding any disruptions, but it was clear Sam had other motives. "I appreciate you telling me, Linda," he said, his voice tight. "It's just frustrating. I've done nothing to disrespect anyone here." Linda gave him a sympathetic look. "I know, Jared. It's not fair, but people get set in their ways, and sometimes they don't want to see what's right in front of them." As she left, Jared felt the familiar weight of anger and frustration settling over him. But he knew he couldn't let it consume him. Instead, he began to form a plan, a way to show the neighborhood his true character without confronting them directly. He'd spent his life working to improve his community, and he wasn't about to stop now. Over the next few days, Jared reached out to the neighborhood association with an idea, a community safety initiative. With his experience as a firefighter, he proposed to lead workshops on home safety, emergency preparedness, and fire prevention. The association, seeing the merit in his proposal, agreed, and soon Jared was at the center of a neighborhood effort. Posters went up around Oakfield Court, inviting residents to attend the first session. On the day of the workshop, Jared arrived early, setting up chairs and preparing handouts. He wasn't sure how many people would show up, if any. But as the start time approached, he was pleasantly surprised to see a steady stream of residents trickling in. Even Sam showed up, his expression guarded but attentive. The session went smoothly, with Jared walking through fire safety basics, answering questions, and sharing stories from his time in the field. By the end, the room was filled with a newfound respect for him. Jared could see it in their faces, a shift from suspicion to appreciation. As the attendees filed out, Linda caught his eye, giving him an approving nod. "That was wonderful, Jared," she said. "You've done more for this neighborhood in one evening than most people have in years." He felt a swell of pride, grateful for her words. This was why he was here, to build, to contribute, to be a part of something larger than himself. Despite the success of the workshop, not everyone was ready to accept Jared. Sam, still wary, approached him afterward. "Well, that was informative," he said, the words clipped. "But I think you should understand that Oakfield Court has always been a certain kind of place. Some of us don't take to change as easily as others." Jared held his gaze, calm but firm. "I'm not here to change Oakfield Court, Sam. I'm here to be a part of it, just like anyone else." Sam narrowed his eyes, his expression a mixture of frustration and reluctance. For a moment, Jared thought he might say something more, but then Sam simply nodded, turning to leave without another word. As Jared watched him go, he realized that some hearts would be harder to reach. But he was prepared to keep trying. It was a quiet Thursday night when the emergency sirens blared through the neighborhood. Jared had just settled into bed when he heard them, the shrill sound breaking the silence. He leapt up and grabbed his phone, immediately switching into crisis mode. Years of training had conditioned him to act first and question later. He glanced out his bedroom window and saw thick smoke rising just down the street. Sam Peterson's house was ablaze. Without a second thought, Jared threw on his shoes and rushed outside, sprinting down the sidewalk toward the flames. Neighbors had already gathered, their faces pale with horror as they watched the fire consume the front porch. The flames had spread quickly, licking up the walls and casting an eerie glow across the lawn. As Jared approached, he saw Sam and Lydia standing on the lawn, holding their young son close, their faces a mix of fear and helplessness. The crowd murmured in panic, but no one seemed to know what to do. Jared didn't hesitate. "Everyone backs up, please," he commanded, moving into action. He quickly assessed the scene, noting the points where the fire was spreading and the areas most at risk. Sam turned, surprise etched across his face as he saw Jared approaching. What are you doing here?" he stammered, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. Jared ignored the question, his mind focused on the task at hand. "Do you have a fire extinguisher?" he asked, his tone calm but urgent. Sam nodded, still stunned. "In the garage, I think." Without missing a beat, Jared dashed to the garage, locating the extinguisher and returning in moments. The flames had already reached the roof, but Jared worked quickly, aiming the extinguisher at the fire's base, slowing its progress until the fire department arrived. When the trucks pulled up, Jared stepped back, his breathing heavy as he watched the professionals take over. He felt a wave of relief wash over him as the flames began to subside, replaced by a thin cloud of smoke. As the firefighters wrapped up, Sam approached Jared, his expression a mixture of disbelief and shame. For a moment, they stood in silence, the sounds of hissing steam and murmuring neighbors filling the space between them. "I didn't expect you to thank you," Sam said, his voice faltering. Jared nodded, still catching his breath. "It's what I do, Sam. I help people." Sam's gaze dropped to the ground. He shifted uncomfortably, as if struggling with words he didn't quite know how to say. "I was wrong about you," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. Jared looked at him, the tension of the past few weeks lingering but tempered by the sincerity in Sam's eyes. "Maybe it's time we all start seeing each other for who we are," he replied, his tone steady. Sam swallowed, nodding slightly. For the first time, Jared saw a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. The fire at Sam's house became a turning point for Oakfield Court. In the days that followed, Jared noticed a subtle but significant change in the way his neighbors treated him. The lingering glances and hushed whispers had quieted, replaced by nods of acknowledgement and hesitant smiles. Linda, always a steady supporter, organized a neighborhood meeting to discuss fire safety, using the recent incident as a call to action. She invited Jared to lead the discussion, and he agreed, recognizing the importance of continuing the bridge building he had started. When the meeting day arrived, nearly the entire neighborhood gathered at the community center. Jared stood at the front, explaining fire safety protocols, emergency preparedness, and the importance of looking out for one another. His words resonated with a sense of unity, a reminder that they all shared a responsibility to keep each other safe. As he spoke, Jared noticed Sam in the back of the room, listening intently. Gone was the wariness Jared had once seen in his eyes. In its place was a tentative respect. After the meeting, Sam approached Jared, his face marked by a mixture of humility and lingering discomfort. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I let my own assumptions get in the way. I've never really had to confront that before." Jared nodded, appreciating the courage it took for Sam to admit his mistakes. "Thank you, Sam. It's not easy for any of us, but understanding's a good start." Their handshake was firm, brief, but carried a weight that words couldn't capture. Around them, other neighbors began to join the conversation, asking Jared about his work, sharing stories, and expressing gratitude for his bravery during the fire. For the first time, Jared felt a sense of true community on Oakfield Court. Linda, encouraged by the recent shifts in attitudes, suggested forming a community advisory board to foster open dialogue and address issues constructively. Jared supported the idea, seeing it as a way to keep the momentum of change moving forward. To his surprise, Sam agreed to join the board, acknowledging that he wanted to be part of the solution. "I may not have it all figured out," he admitted at their first meeting, "but I know this neighborhood could do better." Together, they outlined goals for inclusivity, neighborhood support, and education. Jared proposed regular meetings where residents could voice concerns or suggestions, fostering a culture of openness and respect. The board's first initiative was a community cleanup day, an opportunity for neighbors to work side by side, bridging divides through simple acts of cooperation. On the day of the event, Jared worked alongside Linda, Sam, and others, sharing laughs and stories as they pulled weeds, painted fences, and planted flowers along the neighborhood's main entrance. By the end of the day, Oakfield Court looked brighter, cleaner, and more united than it ever had. Jared felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not only for the work they had done, but for the connections that had grown stronger through it. As the weeks passed, Jared noticed a genuine shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere. Where there had once been barriers of fear and mistrust, there was now a spirit of cooperation and understanding. People who had once kept their distance now waved when they saw him, some even stopping by to chat. Linda, watching these changes, approached Jared one afternoon as he was mowing his lawn. "You've brought something to this neighborhood that I don't think any of us expected," she said, her voice filled with warmth. Jared smiled, leaning on the mower. "I just wanted to be a part of this place, like anyone else." "You've done more than that, Jared," Linda replied. "You've helped us see each other differently. You've helped us become better." Jared felt a wave of gratitude for Linda's words, knowing how much her support had meant through it all. "Thank you, Linda. I couldn't have done it without you." Months later, Jared stood on his porch, watching as neighbors gathered for a barbecue organized by the advisory board. Children played on the grass, laughter filled the air, and the scent of grilling burgers wafted through the street. Sam approached him, holding 2 plates. "Thought I'd bring you a plate. Didn't think you want to miss out on my famous burgers," he said with a grin. Jared chuckled, taking the plate. "Thanks, Sam. I'll be the judge of whether they're as good as you say." They both laughed, a shared understanding now replacing the once tense silence between them. The transformation of Oakfield Court was tangible. A neighborhood that had once been wary and divided was now unified, a testament to the power of understanding and mutual respect. As the sun began to set, Jared looked around, feeling a profound sense of belonging. This was what he'd hoped for, a place where he wasn't just a newcomer, but a valued member of the community. Oakfield Court had become not just a neighborhood, but a home. With the events of the past few months behind them, the residents of Oakfield Court began to adjust to their new normal. The neighborhood that had once been wary of change was now defined by a spirit of inclusion and respect. The advisory board meetings became a staple of community life, and more neighbors started attending, eager to contribute ideas for neighborhood improvement. One evening, Jared found himself seated in his living room, sifting through a series of handwritten letters that had arrived from neighbors who couldn't attend the latest meeting. Some offered suggestions for the upcoming fall festival, while others expressed gratitude for the sense of security they now felt. One letter, from a neighbor he'd only met in passing, struck a chord. "Dear Jared, I'm not one for meetings or gatherings, but I wanted you to know how much safer I feel here now. I used to worry about my kids playing outside or whether we really knew our neighbors. But because of the changes you've helped bring about, I can look out my window and see people who look out for each other. Thank you for making this place feel like home." Jared felt a swell of pride and humility. It wasn't the accolades or recognition that moved him, but the knowledge that his quiet persistence had helped turn Oakfield Court into a true community. As the fall festival approached, Sam approached Jared with an idea. It was an uncharacteristically chilly morning, and Jared was in his front yard when he saw Sam walking over, hands tucked into his coat pockets. "Jared," Sam began, clearing his throat, "I was thinking maybe I could help with the fire safety booth at the festival." Jared's eyebrows raised in surprise. "I'd love that, Sam. We could always use an extra hand." Sam looked relieved, a slight smile breaking his usual stoic expression. "After the fire, I realized how little I actually knew about this stuff. Figured maybe it was time to learn. As they discussed the details, Jared felt the last remnants of tension dissolve. Sam's gesture wasn't just about the festival. It was a step toward genuine understanding and reconciliation. Together, they planned the booth, adding hands-on fire extinguisher demonstrations and tips for families on keeping their homes safe. On the day of the festival, Sam worked alongside Jared, demonstrating fire safety techniques with enthusiasm. Watching Sam explain emergency protocols to a group of young children, Jared felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about keeping people safe. It was about building bonds and trust that would sustain the neighborhood for years to come. The festival was a resounding success, bringing people from all parts of town to Oakfield Court. The event featured food stalls, games, and live music, and it felt like a celebration not just of autumn, but of the neighborhood's growth. Throughout the day, Jared received countless words of appreciation, each one reinforcing the knowledge that his choice to move here had been the right one. Linda, the heart of Oakfield Court's transformation, stood by his side as they watched families laughing, children playing, and neighbors greeting each other with newfound warmth. "You know, Jared," Linda said, her eyes twinkling with pride, "I think Oakfield Court will remember this day for a long time. You've given this place a legacy to build on." Jared chuckled. "I think we all did that together, Linda. I couldn't have done any of this without you and everyone who stepped up." As the festival continued into the evening, Jared's heart swelled with pride and gratitude. He felt not only accepted but cherished, knowing that this was more than a neighborhood. It was a place where he could truly belong. As winter approached, Oakfield Court held its final advisory board meeting of the year. The group gathered at Linda's house, sipping hot cider and reminiscing about the festival. For the first time, there was no tension, no lingering distrust, just laughter and camaraderie. Toward the end of the evening, Linda raised her glass. "To Jared, for showing us how to build a community that cares. And to everyone here, for having the courage to make this place better." The group toasted, smiles all around. Even Sam, who had once been Jared's most vocal critic, nodded in agreement. Jared raised his own glass, humbled by the recognition, but even more grateful for the friendships he had built. "To Oakfield Court," he said, "and to a future where everyone feels welcome." The cheer that followed was warm and genuine, the sound of a neighborhood united by respect and understanding. On a clear winter night, Jared sat on his porch, wrapped in a thick jacket, watching as snow began to fall softly over the neighborhood. The lights from nearby houses glowed warmly in the darkness, and Jared felt a deep peace settle over him. Linda walked over from her house, carrying 2 steaming mugs of cocoa. She handed one to Jared, settling into the chair beside him. They sat in comfortable silence, the quiet hum of Oakfield Court a soothing presence. "You know, I never thought this place would change," Linda said, her voice soft. "We all get so comfortable in our little worlds. But you showed us that sometimes change is exactly what we need." Jared smiled, feeling the weight of her words. "I just wanted a place to call home, Linda. I didn't set out to change anything, but I'm glad I was able to be part of something good here." Linda reached over, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "Well, you've done more than that, Jared, and Oakfield Court is better for it." They sipped their cocoa, watching as the snow continued to fall, blanketing the neighborhood in a soft, peaceful silence. For the first time in a long time, Jared felt completely at home, knowing that he had helped build something lasting, a community bound not by proximity alone, but by understanding and respect. Months later, as spring blossomed over Oakfield Court, Jared stood on his front porch, taking in the familiar sights and sounds of his neighborhood. Children played in the street, laughter echoing through the air, and neighbors waved as they passed by. Jared felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude as he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Oakfield Court was more than just a place to live. It was a place where he had found acceptance, friendship, and belonging. It was a place that had transformed, not just because of him, but because of the willingness of everyone to let go of old fears and embrace a shared vision of unity. As he watched Sam and Linda chatting with another neighbor across the street, Jared felt a profound sense of fulfillment. This was his neighborhood, his community, his home, and he knew that Oakfield Court would continue to grow, shaped by the values they had built together. With a final deep breath, Jared stepped off the porch, ready to join the neighbors he now called friends. He had found not just a home, but a place where he could make a difference, a place where he was seen, respected, and, most importantly, welcomed. As we close this chapter of Jared's journey and the transformation of Oakfield Court, remember that real change starts with each of us. If you believe in the power of community, understanding, and stories that make a difference, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. By subscribing, you're joining a community that values empathy, resilience, and inspiring stories every day. Let's keep spreading positivity, one story at a time. Subscribe, and become part of the movement for change.